There's a particular kind of discovery that can only happen during one's childhood, and it's the kind that arrives without any real context or without a teacher pointing to it or without an older person trying to convince you that something is important. It's the kind that simply just falls into your hands, maybe a little dog-eared and maybe with a stranger's name stamped on the inside cover in that particular ink that only libraries use, a small rectangular withdrawal pocket glued to the back page that's now empty. And this is the kind of discovery that I want to talk about today. I grew up in a very small town in Georgia in the United States called Dallas. If you don't know it, and there's no particular reason why you should know it, it's a small town in a place called Paulding County, and it's in the northwestern corner of the state. And when I was a child, it was quiet in the way that small southern towns up until maybe the 21st century were quiet. It was slower, it was warm, and for a kid like me who was drawn to things that were a little more unusual, I suppose, it was a place that sometimes could feel quite extraordinarily isolating. But there was a library, and this was the the Paulding County Public Library, and I spent a lot of time in that building, and more than most kids my age, I suppose, and more than was probably considered normal. And the thing that I loved maybe the most about that library is, even more than the books you were supposed to check out and return, was this particular section that no one really seemed to pay much attention to. And there was a cart or a shelf or sometimes a small table near the exit where they kept the books that they were discarding. The remaindered books, the ones being pulled from the collection to make room for newer titles. And they were usually priced at about a quarter, maybe 50 cents, sometimes $1 if they were in especially good condition. And I bought them often with money that I made mowing the lawns for people who lived on my street. And I would pocket whatever I'd earned for the week, walk into the library, and I would come home with a small stack of things that nobody else seemed to want, like poetry collections, art books, these sort of strange small press paperbacks with broken spines, things like that. And that's how I found Alfred Kubin. And that almost certainly is how I also found Georg Trakl, both of them remaindered and discarded from the Paulding County Public Library in Georgia, bought by a 10-year-old kid for under $1 each, probably in the same week. I want to sit with that for a moment. These two Austrian artists, one being a visionary graphic artist and novelist, and the other one writing some of maybe the most haunting and devastating poetry of the 20th century. And they were both born in more or less the same era, and they were both connected deeply to the city of Salzburg. And they were both consumed by dreams in this sense of the world as something fundamentally and irredeemably strange. And they both somehow ended up on a discard shelf in a small town public library in Georgia in the hands of a 10-year-old child who would decades later end up living in and recording music not far from the places where both of them had lived and suffered and made their work quite by happenstance. And I think about that coincidence often, and I'm not certain that coincidence is exactly the right word for it. But before I get into this strange alchemy of geography and fate that connects my own life to these two artists, I want to spend a bit of time today inside the world of Alfred Kubin, because Kubin, more than almost anyone I can think of, really requires some time. He requires some patience and a willingness to sit with it and be maybe a little uncomfortable. And He drew from a place that most of us spend our lives trying to avoid, this sort of churning, unlit space between being awake and being asleep, between reason and the collapse of reason. And the more you know about his life, the more inevitable his work seems. So let me start at the beginning. Kubin was born on the 10th of April, 1877 in Leitmeritz, which is a town in the northern part of Bohemia that was, at that time, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's now called of Litoměnše, which is in the Czech Republic. And he was the eldest child of Friedrich Franz Kubin, and a surveyor, and he was a military man, and Johanna Jenny Kubin Kleitzel, who was the daughter of a military physician, and was herself a pianist of some ability. So she was also an artist in her own way, and almost nothing in his early life was easy. His father's profession as a surveyor kept the family moving constantly, and by the time Alfred was a young child, the family had relocated to Salzburg, a fact that will become a little bit more important later. And then to the rural village of Zell am See in Salzburg. It's in the Salzburg countryside where Alfred spent his primary school years. And the family moved frequently, and young Alfred was given little opportunity to put down roots, to form any type of lasting friendships, or to build any real sense of stable ground beneath his feet. I assume that you're detecting a pattern here with so-called creative types, no? And then came, let's say, the first defining catastrophe of his life. And in May of 1887, when Alfred Kubin was 10 years old, his mother Johanna, she died of tuberculosis, and he watched her waste away. He saw his father, who was overwhelmed by grief, carry her emaciated body through the house in a kind of desperate, uncomprehending anguish. And this image of his dead mother, and of his hopeless father, of death entering the home and changing everything about it, it never left him. And he returned to it again and again throughout his career in drawings, particularly of skeletal women and figures of death bending over sleeping children, and of rooms in which some catastrophe had just occurred, and the air still carrying its residue, let's say. And at 10 years old, which is an age at which I find this discarded books in this library that I mentioned earlier in Georgia, this is something, there's something about that parallel that I find a little difficult to not dwell on. But within months of his mother's death, Kubin, his father, remarried, and taking as his new wife Johanna's sister, making the boy's aunt his stepmother. And she died the following year in childbirth. So 2 dead mothers before the boy was even 12. And then the father married a third time to a woman named Irene Kulnel, who seems to have had little interest in the boy, and had in the difficult adolescence that she had inherited from him. And Kubin failed repeatedly at school. He was placed in the grammar school in Salzburg, where he lasted about 2 years without graduating. And he was transferred to a trade school also in Salzburg, where his final report described him with near universal marks of being just unsatisfactory. And he was expelled. And his father, who was a disciplined military officer, he had basically no patience for the failure of his son, and he responded to him with contempt. And the boy retreated even further into himself and into books, into these long, solitary walks through the Austrian countryside, and finally into drawing. And then at around the age of 11 or 12, and Kubin himself was careful about the phrasing here in his later memoirs, an older woman seems to have subjected him to some form of sexual abuse that he described simply as sexual games that upset him beyond measure and cast a shadow well into his manhood years. This is something that he wrote vaguely in his later memoirs, and he did not elaborate on that any further. But this experience, combined with his mother's death and the general atmosphere of grief and disapproval that surrounded his childhood, it planted these deep roots into his psyche, and roots that would later grow into some of maybe the most disturbing and transfixing images in European art at that time. There's ever present the femme fatale, the devouring woman, the sleeping male figure being dominated by a monstrous female presence. And these are not simply aesthetic choices that he made. There seem to be residue of a childhood in which women in general, particularly the ones that he loved, they vanished and were replaced by figures of suffocation and control. The family eventually relocated to Klagenfurt, where Kubin was sent to apprentice as a photographer under his uncle, and he showed no particular gift for photography. And after 4 years of his apprenticeship that seemed to have been quite miserable, he quarreled with an employer. Then he just fled north to Zell am See, and he made his way to his mother's grave with a borrowed and rusty revolver, and he put the barrel to his head to commit suicide, and it thankfully misfired. And then the universe, for whatever reason, was still not finished with Kubin. He collapsed, he wept, he recovered, and then he returned home in shame. And his father, after years of discipline, seems to have recognized finally at this point that something was genuinely wrong with his son, and he softened a little bit, and he gave him some space. And in that space, Kubin began to draw in earnest, to draw with real dedication to his craft. And then in 1898, Kubin's father, who seemed simply to be out of options, he sent his son to Munich to study art. And he had shown, obviously, some talent for drawing, and maybe the discipline of formal instruction he hoped might make something out of him. So he enrolled Alfred into a private academy, and before attempting the Munich Academy proper in 1899, which he left, like every other institution he'd ever attended, he left without completing his studies. But Munich, unlike the institutions within it, they transformed him in a certain way. And this was the Munich of the Jugendstil movement, of the avant-garde, of the slow, extraordinary sort of ferment that would eventually produce Expressionism and all of the aesthetic revolutions of the early 20th century around Expressionism. And the city's museums were full of things that Kubin had never seen before. There was work that spoke directly to this sort of dark and churning interior world that he'd been carrying inside of him since his childhood. And it's there that he discovered the prints of people like Max Klinger. Klinger was a German symbolist who produced these very elaborate, almost visionary sequences of etchings. And his paraphrase on the finding of a glove cycle being around the most maybe remarkable print series of the 19th century, and Kubin was overwhelmed by this. He even later wrote in his memoirs, and I'm reading a quote, he said, "Here a new art was thrown open to me, which offered free play for the imaginative expression of every conceivable world of feeling. Before putting the engravings away, I swore that I would dedicate my life to the creation of similar works." And that oath that he made in a museum in Munich by a traumatized and rootless young man looking at someone else's prints is as close as Kubin ever came to founding any type of movement, despite the fact that many art historians try to claim that he founded an art movement like the Blau Reiter and things like this, but it's just not exactly true. And it's here that he discovered Odilon Redon, the French symbolist, Edvard Munch. And Kubin recognized immediately these two artists as being similar in certain sensibilities to himself. And he read Edgar Allan Poe, he read Hoffmann, he read Dostoevsky, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and he absorbed this in particular the philosophy of Schopenhauer and the ideas that existence is fundamentally characterized by a type of blind, irrational will, by suffering, by desire, that can never be completely or even adequately satisfied. And he felt it confirmed something that he had always maybe known in an intrinsic way. And he really began to draw, and more and more and more, and not carefully, not academically, but more in a feverish way. And the image that poured from him in those first productive years in Munich are really remarkable even now. They're very dense, they're murky compositions, they're executed in a technique that sort of like a spray technique, and in which he applied ink using a spray gun of sorts to create these soft, atmospheric, almost photographic tonal gradations. And the effect is of images seen as if they're underwater or through a piece of gauze or through a dirty window or in that type of uncertain light that exists just before your eyes adjust to darkness, just before you're going to sleep, as if you're looking through a filter. And the subjects that he was dealing with at this time were death, of course, sexuality, violence, and in monsters. For example, in Serpent God in 1903, it's this giant reptilian deity that coils over a landscape of these tiny, helpless human figures. Some people, when they see this, it sort of reminds them of calls people like H.P. Lovecraft to mind, for example, or even another work, The Best Doctor, also from 1903, which is this skeletal figure in a physician's coat that looms over a patient in bed. Or in Government, another work, this massive inhuman creature that sits atop a mountain of these crushed human bodies. And these are obviously not decorative images. They're probably more like psychological projections or externalizations of the interior life that he brought and into this really startling visual clarity, and eventually the art world in general began to notice him. And then by 1902, Kubin was exhibiting in Berlin. In 1903, he was showing also in Vienna, and he was having, you can say, some notable success. One of his collectors published a portfolio of his drawings, and he was becoming quickly, and even to his own surprise, a relatively recognized artist. And he joined a group called the Phalanx Group. It was an association of Munich area artists that also introduced him to Kandinsky. And through this affiliation, he entered the orbit of the artists who would eventually coalesce into the group that I mentioned earlier, the Blau Reiter. And this we had Paul Klee, Franz Marc, and some others, and they all admired his work, and they invited him into their circle. But as I'm sure you can probably imagine, given his rather traumatic childhood, Kubin never was entirely comfortable in any type of circle. He was incapable of belonging to a movement. He felt that they were subordinating his vision. Any type of collective program, he felt this way, was a sort of pollution of what he was really trying to do. And he did participate in the early Blaureiter exhibitions, and his historical associations with the group are important in his biography, but His work always existed in its own sort of distinct territory away from the other artists of the group. His work is it's a lot darker than his colleagues, and it's more personal, and then it's more obsessive, and it's more interested in the unconscious than it is in the, let's say, the spiritual or the abstract. In 1904, he married Hedwig Schmitz. She was a wealthy widow of the author Emmy Hase, and the marriage appears to have been founded on a mutual need rather than any type of passionate love. Hedwig was chronically ill. She was always struggling with depression and eventually a morphine addiction. And Kubin was unstable, poor, and in need of someone to help him manage the practical dimensions of life. But it was, in its own way, a type of partnership. She believed in his work, and she provided the financial stability. And they never had children. So obviously it was a marriage of, as I said before, not necessarily of passion, but a marriage of maybe mutual support. And then in 1906, they bought a small estate, which was a medieval manor house on a 12th century property in Upper Austria, near the Inn River and the German border. And this is the place I want to hold in your mind as an anchor for everything else that's going to follow. From 1906 until his death in 1959, more than 5 decades, Kubin lived and worked in Zwicklet. He almost never left. He did not have a radio. He did not read newspapers, and he existed in a condition of, let's say, very radical self-imposed isolation, connected to the wider world only through, let's say, a pretty extraordinary volume of correspondence. Through the books he illustrated and through the work that continued to pour from his studio, with really undiminished intensity for the rest of his rather long life. Then in 1907, there was another wave of catastrophe for Kubin. His father died, and this death triggered a profound psychological crisis. Not only grief, but something more complex and a little more disturbing. Kubin's relationship with his father had always been defined by tension and disappointment, and the death of his father seems to have dissolved the last structure that organized his sense of self, and it seemed to have left him in a state of complete creative paralysis, and he couldn't draw. He couldn't make images. He even wrote in a letter at this time, and I'm quoting here from his letters, as I don't believe I am an artist any longer. Perhaps I am just a writer, perhaps a philosopher, perhaps something else, a thing or something else again, or I am maybe nothing at all. And there's something contemporary about that sentence, the way it cycles through possible identities before arriving at the possibility of being nothing at all. And anyone who's ever experienced a true creative block of real severity will recognize the texture of that despair. And it was in this time period, during this creative block that he was suffering, that he, sometime previously to this event, he had been commissioned to illustrate, of all things, the Golem, Der Golem, from Gustav Meyrink. Of all of the novels to illustrate, it was this one. This was the one that he was commissioned to do, and he was totally blocked. So he was forced to delay the commission repeatedly. But in spite of this, he still found himself with this large body of illustrations that he'd worked on that just didn't fit with Meyrink's Golem. So Kubin decided to sit down and write his own book. In only 12 weeks, it was 8 weeks for Kubin to write the text and then 4 weeks to revise and produce the final illustrations, Kubin wrote and illustrated the andere Seite, the other side. It was published in 1909 in Munich, and it contained 52 of his drawings, including a hand-drawn map. And I want to talk about this book for a while because I think it is one of the most genuinely unusual and maybe important works of fantastical fiction produced in the early 20th century. And in my opinion, it still remains scandalously underrated. The novel itself, it begins simply enough. There's an unnamed narrator who's an artist, a graphic artist. It's maybe in a certain sense a fictional Kubin, and he receives a letter and a large amount of money from a person named Patera, who was a former school friend that he hadn't seen in over 20 years. And Patera has built a kingdom that he calls the Dream Realm, der Traumstadt, and he has purchased this vast piece of land in a very remote corner of Central Asia, and he transported brick by brick the entirety of a small pre-industrialized European city to this very desolate and isolated location. And he has populated it with 65,000 carefully selected Europeans, people who, like himself, are disgusted with modern culture, and they seek a certain type of refuge in a society that has deliberately rejected the so-called logic of industrialization, so-called progress, and the idea of rational order. And the narrator and his wife, they travel to this kingdom, which is centered on a city called Perle, or Pearl. And from the first moments in Pearl, something is wrong. Not dramatically or catastrophically wrong, not at first, but wrong in the way that a dream can go wrong. The sun never quite rises fully in the dream realm, for example. It's permanently overcast, and it's permanently dim. And the buildings are old and slightly decayed, and the people move with a kind of sleepwalking inertia, going about their daily routines without any apparent purpose or animation. And it recalls Kubin's drawing technique with the ink spray and the graphite spray, where everything seems to be behind this permanent dirty window, this permanent layer of fog where nothing is completely clear. And the narrator gets a job as a newspaper illustrator, and from there he begins to explore the city, and he does reports. He reports in this in a very precise and almost documentary style on all of the bizarre incidents that accumulate around him in the city. And finally, one morning, a bricklayer arrives without any explanation, and he begins to wall up the living room windows. And there's no reason is ever given. There's no explanation that's offered. And the narrator and his wife, they just simply have to accept it. And the way that someone has to accept the logic of dreams. And a coffin is delivered to their apartment by two other men dressed in black, but no one has died yet, let's say. The ruler of the dream realm, the dream kingdom, the Traumstadt, Patera himself, he's almost entirely absent. He's seen in these little glimpses, rarely, like in a dark carriage at the window of this vast crumbling palace. It's like a pale, eyeless figure who he barely seems present in the world that he's created. He's basically analogous to the demiurge, he's a kind of false god, a creator who's made a world, but he can't sustain it in any way. And then the world around him reflects this failure of sustenance. This beautiful, it's beautiful in this decayed way, but it's running down and it's collapsing. And I would hate to make an assumption, but I'm going to. I'm assuming that Kubin did not read the Timaeus by Plato to get the idea of the demiurge. I assume that he sort of instinctively created this concept in the story, and it comes through in a very, very interesting and non-forced way. It's very, very natural, the way that this concept of the demiurge being patera comes through. There's no politics behind it. There seems to be no metaphor that he's trying to force upon anyone. But it comes, and it's a very, very interesting, very, very interesting thing, in my opinion. Then there's a very important turning point in the story with the arrival of a character named Hercules Bell. Hercules Bell is an American. He's a billionaire. He's very energetic and forward-thinking, and he's appalled by the decay of the dream realm, and he wants to develop it. He wants to modernize it. He wants to bring it into the logic of capital and progress and rational management. And it's his arrival, or rather his intrusion, that triggers the apocalypse of this the dream kingdom. And the collapse of the Traumstadt it's extraordinary in its violence and surreal horror. An epidemic of sleeping sickness sweeps through the population, and animals begin to multiply without any type of restraint. There are rats and insects and even horses. They begin filling the streets and overrunning the buildings, and there's violence. There's even sexual violence. Then the architecture begins physically to disintegrate, and then the dead bodies begin piling up, and through it all, the narrator moves in a kind of horrified fascination, reporting and observing, but he's really unable to intervene in any meaningful way or even to escape. And at the novel's climax, Patera and Hercules Bell, the dream and the progress, the demiurge and the American billionaire, they engage in a final confrontation from which they both emerge destroyed. And the narrator, having witnessed the complete annihilation of the world that he chose to inhabit, he walks out of the ruins and he returns to ordinary life, and he's stripped of everything that he ever believed in. And on the final page, below a drawing of Patera's eyeless, decaying face, Kubin wrote only 4 words: the demiurge is a hybrid. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about those 4 words. What does it mean for the demiurge, the creator, the shaper of worlds? What does it mean to be a hybrid? What did Kubin mean by that? And for example, in Gnostic theology, the demiurge is the inferior god who created the material world, not the true God, but a secondary flawed deity whose creation is inherently imperfect and ultimately corrupt. And the dream realm, the Traumstadt, is a creation like that. It's built from nostalgia and the rejection of modernity. And it's not a paradise, but rather it's a beautiful prison that's also slowly and inevitably a tomb. And again, the fact that Kubin had this instinctive quote, this instinctive thing that he wrote, I sincerely doubt that he read Plato's Timaeus, and I really doubt that he ever read anything by Plotinus. So the fact that he came to this conclusion is very, very fascinating to me. And I know that we're focusing primarily on Kubin and his work. and I won't get too much into my own personal interpretations or my own personal ideas on philosophy or politics, but to think about the demiurge being a hybrid, this thing that's building this beautiful tomb for you. We should take this into consideration when we are watching the surveillance state being built around us, in my opinion. And I think that Kubin could serve as a very, very useful window into the type of world that we may see in the very near future that may appear to be this beautiful paradise, but ultimately it will be a tomb and it will collapse. Something that I wanted to mention too that I think separates Kubin from most of his contemporaries in the genre of fantastic literature is he's not interested in shock at all. The most disturbing thing in the other side, the andere Seite, are not the sexual violence, the orgies, and the piles of corpses and animal plagues. Those are actually quiet moments. The inexplicable bureaucratic intrusion, the gradual aging of a servant that no one thinks to notice, or Patera, the ruler of the Traumstadt, who's always absent and never explained. These are the things that he focuses more on. In fact, some people have called The Other Side a key work in literary modernism, and that feels right to me. It's a novel that anticipates Kafka, and we know because Kafka said so directly. I can't find the quote in this moment, but he said so directly that The Other Side was a key influence on The Castle, and the parallel is pretty obvious once you see it. The inaccessible ruler, the endless and purposeless bureaucracy, and the narrator who can neither belong nor escape, and the world that operates according to logic that the protagonist cannot access. Kafka read Kubin carefully, obviously, and the influence is structural. It's structural, but it's maybe not atmospheric, but it's structurally there. And Kubin's novel, I would also like to add, it anticipates even other things. It anticipates the isolated, self-sufficient utopias of Aldous Huxley and George Orwell. It anticipates the dreamlike collapse narratives of Samuel Beckett. And it even anticipates certain strands of magical realism. The novel was published, after all, nearly 3 decades before Garcia Marquez was born, and the dream realm has the same quality of this total self-enclosed abnormality that characterizes 100 Years of Solitude's Macondo. The dream realm, the dream kingdom, der Traumstadt, it's an externalization of the unconscious, and it's a literal rendering made visible of the space below waking thought. And Kubin's ability to give that space a precise and detailed form, to draw its architecture, to describe its inhabitants, to report on its bureaucratic irregularities, and with the precision of a journalist, is what makes the novel both horrifying and instructive. And this is, I think, maybe what I responded to in it as a 10-year-old boy, even without having any of this critical apparatus that was available to me. There's something in The Other Side that speaks directly to a child's experience of the world, in my opinion, as this fundamentally strange and slightly threatening and incomprehensible thing, a world where adults operate according to rules that are never explained, in which familiar things suddenly reveal themselves to be other than what you thought, in which no authority figure is entirely trustworthy or even entirely present. And I think the dream realm for a child is not an allegory, really. It's simply reality. Now I want to spend some time talking about Kubin's visual work, because to focus only on the novel is to miss the larger and more continuous body of work that really defines his legacy. And most people probably would say that it's his visual work that's the most important. I would argue that both the visual work and the literary work are together one body of work, but that's a different story. Over the course of his life, Kubin produced somewhere in the region of maybe 20,000 drawings and illustrations and prints and paintings, and that's a pretty extraordinary number. And it's a testament to both his proficiency and his consistency, to the fact that whatever demons drove him to make images never fully relented, and he never allowed himself simply to stop. His technique, it changed significantly over the course of his very long career. And in the early period, roughly from his arrival in Munich in 1898 through the writing of The Other Side, he used the spray technique that I mentioned earlier, this dense atmospheric fields of ink wash that create this soft, almost photographic tonality in a certain sense above the subjects of the drawing. And these early drawings are among his most appreciated, probably. And they have a quality of being discovered rather than made, as though the image existed in the paper and Kubin's tools kind of revealed it in a certain way. And the figures in these early works, they float above these murky backgrounds, like something seen at the edge of sleep, a woman being swallowed by some great dark entity, a horse rearing before some unseen horror, a skeletal figure sitting in a rocking chair waiting with infinite patience, things like this. And after he wrote and published The Other Side, his technique changed. This sort of misty spray gave way to more frenetic and energetic pen strokes, the lines that move really quickly across the surface, that have a kind of this nervous urgency that seems sometimes to be even barely controlled. And these later drawings are executed in a more linear style, often with even with touches of watercolor sometimes, and they have a quality of almost like classical illustration. There's narrative, they're readable, they're precise in their description of objects and space, but they still remain singular in their atmosphere and emotional register. And he illustrated more than, I believe, 70 books over the course of his career. He chose his subjects carefully. I mean, he gravitated usually toward work that shared his sensibility. Obviously, Edgar Allan Poe, E.T.A. Hoffmann, Dostoevsky, Gogol, Kafka, Meyerink, even Oscar Wilde, Balzac. He even released a dedicated portfolio of drawings titled Visions of Shakespeare in 1918, with figures like Caliban, for example, from The Tempest. He also regularly contributed artwork to Der Orchidengarten, the Orchid Garden, which is historically recognized as the world's very first fantasy and horror magazine. And that is also a magazine that maybe I will tackle in the future, because it's particularly exciting to me. This magazine had beautiful artwork from Alfred Kubin. It had these wonderful stories from Hans-Hein Evers, Karl Strobel, and others that have been almost completely forgotten to history, that I think many of you that are listening to this would probably really enjoy. Now, I mentioned very, very briefly earlier Georg Trakl. In 1947, more than 3 decades after Trakl's death, this remarkable book was published by Otto Müller Verlag in Salzburg. And it contained 4 of Georg Trakl's prose poems. Verwandlung des Bösen, which is the transformation of evil, Winternacht, Winter Night, and Traum und Umnachtung, Dream and Madness, and Offenbarung und Untergang, the Revelation and Fall. That was accompanied by, I believe, 13 pen and ink drawings by Kubin. And the essay that introduced the collection was titled Alfred Kubin's Trakl Verwandlung, the Alfred Kubin's Traklian transformation, let's say. And the pairing of these two artists is not arbitrary. It's one of the most natural artistic pairings of anything that I've ever read. Honestly, it's Trakl and Kubin. They were near contemporaries. They shared a certain world, which was the world of the turn of the century Austria-Hungary, and it was a world of decay and premonition, and the world of an empire feeling its own dissolution from within. And they shared a certain aesthetic, which was sort of this fragmentation in the image as the carrier of something that prose and reason in itself can't really hold. And they shared with this. They also shared literally a certain geography. Georg Trakl was born in Salzburg in 1887, and he spent his formative years there attending school there. He worked as a pharmacist's assistant there also. And Salzburg is in his poetry the way that a scar is on a body. It's everywhere, even when it isn't named. And Alfred Kubin, he spent time in Salzburg throughout his life. Probably most significantly is when he was a teenager, when he was attending school there, failing and being expelled, and beginning this long interior journey toward art. The Kubin family biography describes the city as this type of recurring anchor point. And I, quite without planning it, without knowing what it would mean, ended up living in a town called Freilassing. And for those of you who don't know it, Freilassing is the last city in Germany before you get to the Austrian border. And it's just across the Inn River from Salzburg. From Freilassing, you can see the spires of Salzburg. In the winter, you can hear the bells. And it is, in the most literal geographical sense, the threshold of Salzburg. And I was there because of my band, Feeding Fingers. I recorded the fourth album there, The Occupant, which was released in 2013. And I recorded it partly at the Mozarteum in Salzburg, the Mozart School of Music, and partly at another music school that was nearby. And The Occupant, I've always found it interesting that I gave that name to the album that I made in the borderland of Trakl and Kubin's world. There's something fitting about it to me, the occupant of a space that doesn't fully belong to you, a space whose history precedes you and whose weight you feel without really understanding its source. And while I was living there, I remember visiting a museum or a gallery in Salzburg, and the owner was deeply, deeply passionate about Kubin's work. And in that space, I saw a painting by Kubin that really stopped me in my tracks, as Das Weiße Haus, the White House. And if you know Kubin's work, you may know this image. It's a pale, isolated building rendered in a wash of this really eerie, cold light, and the building seems to have seems as if it's been abandoned, not recently, but permanently, and it seems to exist outside of ordinary time and space. I remember that the gallery owner offered to sell me the painting for 10,000 euros, and I did not have 10,000 euros. I would have loved to have bought the painting, and I still think about that painting often. In fact, I mentioned that painting to a friend of mine who recently had an art show here in Italy in Avellino, and there's something almost unfair about the proximity of great things to one's financial reality. To be within reach of something that you know with absolute certainty would change something essential about the quality of your daily life, and the presence of an object that carries a bit of weight and history, and to be separated from it by a gap measured in something as ephemeral as money. And I understand intellectually that this is simply how the art market works, but emotionally the gap feels like a different kind of a wall. And I remember the owner of the gallery was a bit of an elderly man who understood Kubin in the way that a genuine enthusiast understands their subjects, not academically and not distantly, but personally, and as though Kubin's world overlapped significantly with his own. And we talked for quite a long time. He told me about the drawings, about the paintings, about how Kubin's technique evolved. He also gave me a book that he wrote. And he also talked a bit about the late work, which is often overshadowed by the more dramatic early work. But it has its own extraordinary quality as well. And there's a kind of serene darkness that seems to, in a certain sense, make peace with itself. And I remember the man, the owner of the gallery, telling me stories about how he walked through certain alleyways and certain streets that Kubin also walked down as he was sketching, and he clearly had a deep passion for the work. And I remember walking back to my apartment carrying this knowledge of a painting that I couldn't have past the border back to where I was writing music, and this became the occupant. Of all the places in the world for some poor kid from a rural little area outside of Atlanta, Georgia, to end up in. And now I want to return to Kubin's life after he wrote The Other Side, Die andere Seite. Because what happens next in its own quiet little way is almost as remarkable as anything that he'd done before. He completed the novel, and he worked through this creative crisis that he had, and he retreated more or less fully into where he was living in Upper Austria. And it wasn't a temporary withdrawal. This was a permanent reorientation of his life. And from 1909 until his death 50 years later, he basically never left Upper Austria. He declined exhibitions, he avoided openings, he refused almost all social invitations, but he had a correspondence, a voluminous correspondence. He wrote letters to Kafka, Thomas Mann, Paul Klee, Ernst Junger, and to countless other writers and artists that can fill volumes. So he engaged with the world almost entirely through paper. And this reclusion was not a depression. It was, I think, maybe a form of a clarity about what he needed in order to work. Because I think Kubin understood with precision the conditions under which at least his imagination functioned. He required silence. He required the particular quality of maybe even of light in Upper Austria, which is in the light of the Inn Valley. It's greener there. It's colder than the light further south, and the light that carries the shadow of the mountains in it, even on clear days. And I think maybe he required freedom from the noise and negotiation of the urban artistic life. And within this solitude, he really, really worked. The late drawings have a quality that's harder to name than the early ones. They're a lot less violent, but in certain ways, a little bit more unsettling. They have the quality of late Rembrandt or late Goya, but his virtuosity became invisible in a way. He absorbed entirely into the image, and so that what you see is not technique but pure vision. And he continued to illustrate books throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and his income came largely from his work. He was one of the at the time, he was one of the most sought-after illustrators in the German-speaking world, and publishers approached him pretty regularly with commissions. And the commissions he accepted, but he accepted them pretty selectively. He was particular about his subjects, and he would not illustrate work that didn't resonate with his sensibility. And then the Nazi period brought a particular form of complication to him. In 1938, following the Anschluss, his work was declared degenerate art, entartete Kunst. And it was applied to many of the greatest artists of this period: Paul Klee, Kokoschka, Kirchner, Kandinsky. But Kubin's response to this was just to continue working and to essentially know nothing about it, because he didn't have a radio and he didn't read newspapers. So when the German troops marched into Austria in March of 1938, he later said he was completely taken by surprise. He had no idea, and he'd been simply unaware of the political developments. And because he was already in a condition of effective inner exile, let's say, living in a remote rural estate, making drawings that no one in the Reich particularly wanted, he managed to survive the period relatively undisturbed. And unlike many of the other artists that were banned, he did not have to go into inner exile, as one historian put it, because he was already effectively there. And this is one of the strangest aspects of his life, maybe, his reclusion, which might look like avoidance or immaturity or passivity. But for him, it functioned as a form of protection, and his isolation made him invisible, so his art continued. And then after the war, Kubin was celebrated as a national treasure by an Austria that was now belatedly proud of what he had produced. And he received retrospectives, state prizes, honorary degrees, even the Austrian Great State Prize for Art, which was awarded to him in 1951. And he was represented in Venice, the Venezia Biennale in 1950 and 1952, and galleries in Munich, Vienna, even New York, and other places. They mounted these major exhibitions of his work. And speaking of New York, the Gallery Saint Etienne in New York, it mounted its first American solo exhibition as early as 1941, and this gallery continued to represent him, and it brought his work to American audiences who were at the time largely unfamiliar with it. And the connection between Kubin and American collectors was always a little uneasy. His work was maybe just too dark or too European in its sources and literary references and concerns in general. So the American audiences at the time were little interested in the kind of, let's say, decorative beauty that dominates the American market at that time period for it to become wildly popular. But those who encountered it really encountered it in a strong way. And he continued to draw until the last months of his life, and he died on August 20th, 1959, in the same house that he'd lived in for more than 50 years. And he was 82 years old. And as I mentioned earlier, he had no children. So when he died, he divided his artistic estate was divided equally between two different institutions. One in Vienna and one in Linz. And those two institutions today hold the most comprehensive collections of his work. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about the ways in which Kubin's work has moved into other media, because I find these adaptations, even the imperfect ones, maybe especially the imperfect ones, interesting as a record of how different eras have understood the dream realm, their Traumstadt, and what they've needed from it. Maybe the most significant cinematic adaptation has been Traumstadt, translated into the English release as Dream City, and it was directed by a German filmmaker, Johannes Schaff, and it was released in November of 1973. It starred a Swedish actor, Per Oscarsson, and the German actress, Rosemarie Fendel, and it was shot over the course of 6 months in what was then Czechoslovakia. Schaff's film it's a loose adaptation, and this has been the source of a lot of debate among Kubin enthusiasts and purists, because in the film the novel's characters are transported from Central Asia of 1909 to the West Germany of the 1970s. And Hercules Bell, the novel's American antagonist, becomes a black American radical whose arrival triggers not just the collapse of the Dream Kingdom, but also a kind of political revolution. In the film, it's pretty dense with 1970s symbolism, countercultural imagery, the sexual revolution, anxieties of liberalism colliding with the anxieties of authoritarianism. And in fact, the New York Times critic, Vincent Canby, he described the film as an interior decorator's dream full of bizarre sets and costumes and makeup. And he also called it a nightmare that can't make up its mind whether its interests are aesthetic or moral. And that is, in my opinion, a pretty precise description of the film. Schaff was drawn to Kubin's visual world, the decayed architecture, the dreamlike light, the figures who move through space with the quality of hallucinations, but he was less interested in maybe the novel's more metaphysical dimensions and the idea of the demiurge and the dream as theological categories. He wanted to make a film about the failure of utopian idealism, and he used Kubin's infrastructure for that purpose, and maybe that was a mistake. This seems to be an unfortunate trend among not only filmmakers, but artists and writers in general, this desire to take something that they admire from another artist and then superimpose their own political ideology on top of that work and use the work as something like not a Trojan horse, but something as like a vehicle to transport their own political ideologies or interpretations of the work into an audience's mind. And when they do this kind of thing, and generally speaking, they do a great disservice to the original artist's work. It's generally, in my opinion, not a good idea to transpose your own interpretations and personal beliefs in philosophy, religion, politics onto another person's work and then use that other person's work as a transport mechanism. Unfortunately, we're seeing that happen quite a bit now, and come up with your own ideas. But coming back to Schaff's film, the results of it's fascinating, even if it's even if it's flawed. But it's a film that rewards viewing if you've read the novel as a kind of archaeological artifact or a record of how the 1970s German new wave cinema understood the relationship between dream and political reality, and it's between aesthetic freedom and social catastrophe. But the film doesn't really capture what is most essential about Kubin. The quiet horror, the bureaucratic strangeness, the sense that the collapse is happening at the level of perception rather than at the level of the event. I think maybe a more successful adaptation of Kubin's work, it might actually be the 2010 opera Die andere Seite that was composed by Michael Obst and Hermann Schneider. It has this, I don't know, opera in general, or musical theater, for me, it has a capacity to hold music and image and text in a simultaneous type of tension that may be a more natural medium for Kubin's material than film. And the Dream Kingdom's combination of this precise, almost documentary reporting and complete atmospheric unreality, the way it makes the extraordinary ordinary and the ordinary extraordinary, is maybe better suited to the suspended logic that you can find in opera or theater in general. Robert Wiene and Murnau, they were drawing on a shared cultural atmosphere, a shared vocabulary of the uncanny that Kubin had. He had helped create that. But also when you put Kubin's drawings next to the set designs of Caligari, you see the same concerns, the architecture itself as a psychological state, buildings as externalizations of interior suffering or interior terror, and space as something that behaves irrationally, that it tilts and presses and refuses to be neutral. And the same genealogy runs forward, even if less directly, into much of what we call horror cinema now. And the specific techniques, the way architecture is used to generate unease, the quality of light that's never quite naturalistic, and the figures who move in space as though the space itself is resistant to their presence, to the presence of the characters. These are techniques that Kubin worked out in ink on paper decades before they became a cinematic grammar. There's even a very interesting cinematic anecdote that I remember reading a long time ago. I don't remember specifically where I read it, but Hans Janowitz, he was one of the writers of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. He told a story that that captures the strange, unstable mythology that surrounds the creation of that film itself, and the strange, unstable mythology that surrounds Kubin in his life. According to Janowitz, after the screenplay of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was purchased, production on the film stalled for months and months and months while the filmmakers were searching for the right visual style. And he himself, he claimed that he originally wanted the sets designed in the spirit of illustrations of Alfred Kubin, his work is also, it's filled with jagged shadows and nightmarish distortions and things like this. And Janowitz said he even tried to bring Kubin himself onto the project, but the artist, as usual, Kubin declined. But then the story becomes a little bit stranger. In another version of this anecdote, Janowitz claimed that he asked the studio, Dekla, for Kubin paintings as a visual reference, and supposedly someone at the studio misread the request as cubist painters. And whether by accident or a misunderstanding or an embellishment, that confusion may have helped push Caligari toward the more warped and angular expressionist style that made it one of the visually most influential films ever made from the visual side. And like so much surrounding Caligari, nobody agrees on whether the story is actually true. So this is a possibility. So this is a very interesting thing. There is the possibility that Caligari, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, was originally visually supposed to be taken from or inspired directly by Kubin, but then through a misunderstanding, it became this combination of Kubin and Cubism together, which is why it doesn't visually look like a direct adaptation, but rather a hybrid of these two visions. And now I would like to come back to where I started with Kubin. As I mentioned before, as a 10-year-old child, maybe a little bit older, I had no knowledge of Expressionism at the time. I had no knowledge of symbolism. I had absolutely no knowledge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the turn of the century Europe or the Blaureiter art group. None of this. I didn't know that, and I certainly had no idea that this geography that I would eventually inhabit later in life was the same geography saturated with the presence of Kubin and Trakl. That discarded book, this unloved, remaindered copy of of an Austrian artist's work sitting on a cart near the exit of a small public library in rural Georgia, that book changed the direction of my life in ways that I'm still, decades later, unable to fully account for. It gave me a certain access to language that I had always felt, but I couldn't really describe. And it's an interesting thing to think about this. I mean, even the edition of the book that I bought there for less than $1 from money that I made mowing lawns. It was the one that was translated by Denver Linvey. It was a Penguin Modern Classics that was published in 1973. And as a child, when I bought this book, certainly what drew me to it was the cover, the art, and then flipping through it, seeing the sketches from Kubin. If something drew me to this book, I read it, and it changed the trajectory of my life. And I'm not the type of person who believes necessarily in providence in any simple or theological sense, but I do believe that certain patterns in a life have a coherence that isn't entirely logical or accidental, and that the things you encounter, particularly in childhood, the things that reach you before you have any real defenses against them, you haven't developed any antibodies against these things. They have a way of directing you toward the physical geography that they came from, as though the books themselves know where they want you to end up. And that copy of Kubin that I bought in the Paulding County Public Library was in some sense a map. It just took me 20 years to find the territory by pure happenstance. And now Kubin's influence is both everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. It's nowhere because he never achieved the kind of mainstream recognition that would give him a household name. And even now, outside of German-speaking countries, he's known mainly only to specialists, maybe to some illustrators and to art collectors, and to some people who enjoy reading literature from that time period. But at the same time, his influence is everywhere because of the visual language that he helped to create, even if by accident, as I mentioned earlier in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. There's this grammar of darkness and dream and the uncanny that that's permeated the culture so thoroughly that we swim in it every day without even knowing its source. So before I leave, before I get out of here, there are a few things that I would like to add. If you've enjoyed listening to this, you may find it interesting also that several years ago I made an episode of a podcast that was titled Subjected to Justin Curfman. I made an episode about Georg Trakl. The episode was recorded and intended to be used in Austria on Austrian radio on the ZDF network. But you can find that episode online in everywhere. Just do a quick search and you'll find it. And there may be some information that you may enjoy if you're interested in the work of Georg Trakl. I have been wanting to tackle the subject of Alfred Kubin for quite a while. I also had the intention of doing a documentary, either visual or audio, several years ago that never came to fruition because I couldn't find the proper funding for it. And I know that earlier I said that I wanted to continue with this podcast, focusing more on the Italian humanities. But for some reason recently, I've had this desire, something pulling me to do this episode on Kubin. So I hope you enjoyed it. I don't know where I'm going to go next. I don't know if I'm going to go back to Italian humanities, or if I'm going to continue, or if I'm going to start going in the direction of German, or if I'm going to do something altogether. All I can say is thank you for being along with me for the ride, and we'll see where it goes. And if you've enjoyed what you've been listening to, your support would be really appreciated. You can find me at justincurfman.net. There's a Patreon page. There's a Substack page. You can subscribe to that to help me out. There's also, I accept direct PayPal donations. You can find the information on my website. Your support is appreciated. Your support is fundamental in keeping this going. Follow me on YouTube. Follow me wherever you like, and I will be there. And I will see you next time on the next episode of this podcast. Have a great day. Thank you.